Hey, welcome to Friday night's video. I started putting a video up every Friday night again. Welcome all you new subscribers. And tonight we had talked, well, yeah, the last video we talked about the C-50 clarity guides. And I certainly hope you Googled that and looked at that. I try to keep this concept really simple. In the last video we addressed this issue as far as convolution reverb and impulse responses. And I recommend a convolution reverb because you can get impulse responses that emulate plate reverbs or and spring reverbs and things like that. So I really use that reverb most of the time, almost everything, because of how I see reverb and what it should be doing. So we talked about how to deal with that and what kind of benefits these C-50 clarity guidelines can have on shaping your own impulse responses and creating your own that are really going to be much more useful in your productions. So I hope you watch that video. In this video, we're just going to address this issue directly, dealing with the tail end of your whatever sound you're dealing with and trying to cut it back so that you are cutting out mud. You've got initial sound, useful reflections up to about 50 milliseconds. The guides are different sometimes on dialogue and music. So I'm not going to get into that. Just the basic concept of trying to get rid of detrimental reflection that cause mud, cause unclarity, and things like that. Because you have initial sound, you have some early reflections, late reflections. And I showed you in the last video on my impulse responses, I'll cut them down to 50 milliseconds, 40, 30, 20, even down to 10 milliseconds. Does that make sense? To really make it so that it's the actual reflections, the direct sound and the reflections afterwards can be cut way off to really hyper clean the clarity of the sound or the instrument or something like that. So the concept's really simple, and it really boils down to dealing with ADSR, part of dealing with ADSR of a sound. So, or does that make sense? So vocals can be kind of tough. But, with a vocal or something like that, you can either use something like an ADSR tool, like I'll use this LFO tool. I like this one a lot. This LFO tool is really cool because I can really address dealing with the sound really well. Like this is a basic drum reduction shape that's got the initial hit going up to the attack and how long it sustains, and then bam, how far I want it off. Sometimes I want it farther out, 50 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, 30 or 40 milliseconds. I don't know, but this tool is really good for that, dealing with the ADSR, which in this application, I'm basically dealing with the tail end of the sound, which a lot of ADSR tools or transient shapers may deal with that or help you deal with that, or a compressor can help you deal with that also. So anyway, the concept's real simple, and even on vocals, sometimes they're very difficult to deal with. And I'll actually go in there and around some of these places, I'll go back through here and I'll actually cut, by hand and bring that in to try to cut that sound off sooner in the mix, depending on what I'm doing. But the concept of this, and the same thing with drums, I mean, I got like a kick drum hit here or a bass hit here that I want to clean up, and I either want to do it like this to try to clean it up so it doesn't have as, by hand. I'll use I've got a tool here that'll find all the transients, mark all the transients, and then I'll go out and find out how far from using the time base of seconds to see how long the hit is. Or I'll use this tool here, something like this LFO tool that can deal with the ADSR, that can really, I can know exactly how many milliseconds afterwards or fairly close to it that I'm, in listening to how long I want it to go to catch that tail end of that sound. Now this basically, the concept of this is if you do this on your individual tracks, that you can really clean up the sound immensely to where you are really cleaning up any mud, because you've got the mud on the individual track, and that starts to mix together as you start to mix other tracks together. Pretty soon you have a muddy mess to where at the end of the mix you really wish you had some space to add a little bit of some kind of cathedral to the whole mix to try to glue the whole mix together so it sounds like it was being played in the same damn place. But you can't, because it's already a muddy damn mix that you can't, it's a muddy mess that you really can't add any more reverb to. So sometimes you might want to clean up each individual track more than you might think. Like this vocal or this bass, this kick drum. I get done with it, and by itself it sounds great. I don't mess at all. Yeah, dude, it sounds sweet. But the problem is it's got to get mixed into the mix. So I might want to clean it up. It's got this tail end that goes out 80 milliseconds. And I'm like, no, with what either this tool or by hand, I'm cutting it down to like 30 milliseconds or 40 milliseconds, the tail on it after the initial impact, right? Those later reflections. And it sounds a little bit dry, and it sounds maybe a little bit drier than I think it should be, but I can always go back after I get in the mix and I go, okay, now the mix sounds good, and I'm going to put it in its place. And once I've got a pretty good sound, and I know what I'm dealing with, and I've got it cleaned up really well, all the individual tracks, and then when I go, okay, I'm going to put it all in this, jazz club, this, I'm taking the impulse responsive choice, and I'm basically shooting for like a jazz club kind of spatialization. So I start adding a little bit of that in there, the convolution reverb, until it's kind of glued together. Then I realize, well, no, I have to go back because there's too much reverb on that vocal. So I have to take some of that off, go back and figure out how to fucking get some of that off there, because now it's starting to muddy it. Or on the kick drum, there's not enough. The kick drum sounds too sterile. It doesn't sound like it's in its own space. It sounds like I recorded it in a box, and it's not really blending in with the rest of the thing. So I got to go back and, say, okay, well, maybe 40 milliseconds, 40 milliseconds on that cut back, or that I've used this LFO tool to deal with the ADSR. I'll cut it back to 40 milliseconds. Or I go back and use, like we talked in the last video, I might use a different convolution reverb with a different impulse response with a longer tail on it, maybe 30 or 40 milliseconds rather than I started out with 10. This is a huge concept. It sounds complicated, but the whole concept of this can really add mountains of clarity to your mix so that you can really get a good understanding of how to deal with it. If you start cutting that back and you start to realize that all of a sudden you got all this clarity. That way later on you've got let's say you've got here's a good example. Let's say you've got 5 violins. Does that make sense? Or 5, or let's not use that example. Let's just use it. I don't want to get too complicated. You've got the mix. And you really, at the end of it, before you were having this muddy problem, now you figure out how to clean that up a little bit. So with the things we've talked about in the last 2 videos, and you can add, you've got this cathedral that, you've got an impulse response of it that you've cut down, like we talked in the last video, and you can add something to it, and it's not muddying your mix. It's actually blending the stuff together really well and doing what it's supposed to do, because you've done these initial things well, and that way that it's like, oh yeah, dude, it sounds like they're all instruments being played in the same place in this cool jazz club that's glued together. They don't sound disconnected like they're in different places. They all sound nice and uniform. They're blending together well. It's not muddy. It's nice and clear, but you can tell you can't really hear a bunch of reverb, but it's really obvious that it sounds good, and together. Does that make sense? And it's blended them together well, and does that make sense? Because sometimes I'll use a different convolution reverb and impulse response on my kick drum or on my bass or on my vocals. Does that make sense? Because of the vocal itself and how I want it to sound. Does that make sense? For different types of applications. But that doesn't mean I still want the listener to think it's all in the same space at the end of the mix. So you got to be real careful to go easy on that. That way later on you can add more sugar to the kick drum, but it's hard to take the sugar out unless you use something like RX6, which I don't recommend that process. Just go light on it. You can always go back and say, no, the kick drum needs a little bit more. It sounds glued together at the end of the mix, when I use my reverb bus, but it needs a little bit more. So I'm going to go back in there and I'm going to lengthen it out a little bit, or I'm going to use a longer convolution reverb like we talked in the last video to give it a little bit more space, because it sounds a little dry and it could use just a little bit more. But these concepts are huge, because when you start to do a radio ready production, things sound way more clear. You can do more with it, because basically as you start to mix it everything is much more clear to your ears, and if it's done, you can hear mistakes better, you can hear things that aren't done well better. That way you can correct the things you're supposed to be correcting well, instead of just starting to push faders around and going, well, it just sounds like muddy crap, and does that make sense? And if I push the bass up just a little bit, it really isn't doing that much, because it's all blended together and it's a muddy mess. If you touch the fader just a little bit on the bass, and it's real noticeable, because it's a very well done and done cleanly, and you've really taken the time to make sure that there's clarity on that track. Does that make sense? So it's very much noticeable, because you've dealt with that issue very well. So I'm not going to go on and on. I try to make any concepts that I try to show people, I try to keep it as simple as possible so that, I'm not trying to tell you how to do it exactly, because there's, thousands of different recording, mixing, and mastering engineers, and they all might do it a little bit differently. But, the concept is very simple to get across to you, is really focus on getting your clarity in your mix on each individual track and on the mix itself. It's really hard to deal with this concept on the whole mix, because once it's got to that point, you don't have a waveform that you can really deal with that, and there's too much going on. So you really have to focus on doing this on the individual tracks so that that clarity is present when you start to mix all those tracks together. And I guarantee if you experiment around this, which you need to, I'm trying to point out what this concept is to you so that you can really go experiment with it and really hear what's going on with it and really understand when you start mixing tracks together what the clarity that's happening there as far as each of the individual instruments and the mix itself. And understanding that sometimes, you might cut back a little bit more on here than you think on this kick drum when you're listening to it by itself, but it might sound awesome in the mix. Does that make sense? That's a huge concept to get through your head. So, peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in next Friday's video and get some clarity in your mix. See you in the next vid.